I mean, the reality is, and I don't want to get into a whole bunch of numbers here, that's the only oil the U.S. is going to be getting. Okay, it's either from our tar sands or from Hugo Chavez's tar sands. Which one do you want? I'll put my money on ours.
Let's open it up to the floor. There's a mic in the middle. If you want to ask a question, please proceed to it. But Jeff, let me offer another question. You're suggesting, you're arguing oil prices will increase significantly in the next few months, just as the North American economy is coming out of recession, probably government-driven more than anything else. Interest rates low, but possibly going to go up in 2010. Where does that lead us to a year from now?
Well, I think our problem is that we misdiagnosed the true cause of this recession. We thought it was really a financial market shock. And as a result, we've gone hugely into debt, particularly the United States, but we're not scot-free either. In the United States, the deficit is of World War II levels. And just as oil, we bailed out, everybody under the sun, but as I pointed out in my earlier remarks, there can be no energy bailout. The problem's going to be, John, that, just as we start to have to repay these things, just as we go into deficit reduction campaign and the government sector all of a sudden becomes a brake on the economy as opposed to an accelerator, that's when we're going to reacquaint ourselves with triple-digit oil prices. And, that's going to be a challenging environment. Again, I don't think at the end of the day that we can do anything to avert another energy shock. The question is, can our economy adapt to triple-digit oil prices? I think it can, but racking up World War II deficits in retrospect is going to be far greater a hindrance than a help.
We'll get to a question, but presumably that sort of adjustment requires significant public investment, for which there won't be the resources, given what you've just laid out.
I don't think we need public investment. As again I say, I'm an economist. Prices is my religion. As much as I would like everyone in the world to go and buy my book at $4.50 a copy to me, the simple fact of the matter is that when oil gets to $150 a barrel, you all know exactly what to do. You won't have to buy my book. You'll figure out to get rid of the SUV, okay? You'll figure out that commuting 50 kilometers from Stouffville to Bay and Adelaide just doesn't make any economic sense. That 4,000-foot suburban monster you have no longer is economically viable. That you just can't fly to Las Vegas with some buddies over the weekend to have a round of golf. And you know what? In January, if you want blueberries and raspberries, you go to the canned goods section. You'll figure all of that stuff out yourself, and what will allow you to figure all of that stuff out is my religion, prices. Because you won't be able to afford to live any other way. But please, buy my book in advance.
Federal government, given that there's climate change talks in Denmark and their attitude towards the tar sands, and given that the provincial Liberals do not allow electric cars on the roads, would the substitution be walking, bicycling, public transit in lieu of high oil prices used to move cars?
Okay. Well, let me answer that in a little different way. What do I expect to happen at Copenhagen, which is the new Kyoto framework? I expect absolutely nothing to happen at Copenhagen. But here is the problem, okay? And it's a problem as challenging and as pressing as triple-digit oil prices itself. It is not China and India that took us from 280 parts carbon to 390 parts carbon in the atmosphere. I mean, half of the schoons from Charles Dickens' time is still up there. That's all, you know, us, the OECD. But it's not from the OECD that's going to take carbon from 390 to some environmental tipping point. That's all about India and China. World coal consumption is expected to double in the next 20 years. 80% of that increase is from two countries, China and India. But the reality is that if you look at energy consumption per capita, it's about 1/10 in China and India as it is in North America. So when we talk about carbon management, you know what they call it? They call it eco-imperialism. And, you know, from a historical standpoint, they're right. They will come back and say, come back and talk to us in 100 or 50 years when we have comparable energy consumption per capita. Reasonable, except that the atmosphere may not have 50 years. And the atmosphere doesn't care where the emissions come from because there's no boundaries up in the biosphere. So, does it make any sense at all for us to take any actions on our own carbon abatement if this is not a world exercise? No, it is not. And the proof of that is that global emissions are growing ever more rapidly every year, while emissions from the OECD basically have not grown for the last 4 to 5 years. So how do we get traction with countries like China and India? Well, you can't prevent China from building coal plants for their domestic economy. But what you can do is make sure that dirty energy practices in India and China and the developing world cannot be used as an unfair trade advantage. Because if you do allow them to do that, you make your domestic producers pay twice. Once for their own emissions, and then make them pay again to lose market share to people who refuse to pay for their emissions. So what I would argue is that what we need is a carbon tariff. So that if, for example, we import steel from China, the emissions, the CO2 emissions that are embodied in that steel get priced or charged the same as our own producers would get charged for their emissions. Now, right now, they're getting charged zero. So that's exactly the tariff that we could apply to Chinese or Indian emissions. But if you don't do that, you will never get support from domestic industry to put a price on their emissions, and for good reason. It would be economic suicide. But let's understand who has the real comparative advantage. We have the real comparative advantage. Let me give you an example: steel. To produce a ton of steel in North America emits 1/3 less carbon than it does in the developing world, and particularly China. If emissions are free, that is absolutely of zero economic significance. But all of a sudden, if emissions are $60 a ton, that's as important as the transport costs of triple-digit oil prices, or maybe as important as the wage difference. And if you do that, you totally change the political dynamics here. You allow Archie Bunker to get in bed with Al Gore. You create an alliance between the environmental movement and labor, so that instead of sending jobs away by raising the environmental bar, you actually bring them back home. So, you know, I think the key here is we got to put a price on our own emissions and a carbon tariff on everybody else's.